Hey guys, welcome to today's presentation. As you can see, the topic is the science of dopamine. You aren't lazy, you are overstimulated. In my opinion, this is a very important topic for modern men and for anyone that is lacking focus, motivation and drive. This presentation will explain what is dopamine and how dopamine affects your energy and motivation. Let's go through the overview, how dopamine works, the modern overstimulation trap, low baseline dopamine and identity, spike lifestyle versus stable drive, rebuilding your baseline, intentional dopamine strategy, review and action. The description of the video also includes timestamps, so you can jump to whatever chapter you are interested in. Let's start with first chapter, how dopamine works. Dopamine is a critical neurotransmitter and hormone produced in the brain that acts as a chemical messenger between nerve cells, essential for regulating pleasure, motivation, memory, motor control, and focus. Dopamine is often called the feel-good hormone. It fuels the brain reward system, reinforcing behaviors by releasing pleasure chemicals when eating, accomplishing goals, or experiencing affection. It is a common misconception that dopamine is the pleasure molecule. In reality, dopamine is the molecule of more. At its core, it's essentially a chemical messenger that allows neurons to talk to one another by crossing the synaptic gap. Think of dopamine as the brain's internal currency for satisfaction. It tells us what we should pay attention to and what is worth our effort. Key functions and aspects of dopamine. Reward and motivation. Dopamine is released when your brain is expecting a reward, reinforcing behaviors that feel good and motivating you to repeat them. Motor control. It is vital for movement, and deficiency is a major factor in Parkinson's disease. Brain and body functions. Beyond mood, it impacts learning, attention, sleep, and kidney function. Addiction. Addictive substances like nicotine and cocaine cause massive and natural spikes in dopamine, reinforcing unhealthy, confusing behaviors. Dysfunction. Imbalances, whether too high or too low, are linked to mental health conditions such as schizophrenia, ADHD, and Parkinson's disease. One of the most fascinating aspects of this system is reward prediction error. The brain isn't just reacting to rewards, it's constantly running simulation of what might happen. When you expect a coffee and get a coffee, dopamine levels stay relatively flat. However, if that coffee is unexpectedly delicious, you get a positive error spike. Conversely, if the shop is closed, your dopamine drops below baseline, a negative error. It seems to me that we aren't wired to be happy with what we have, but rather to be acutely sensitive to the difference between our expectations and reality. The brain doesn't have a single pleasure center, but rather two separate systems that usually, but not always, work in tandem. Wanting is the process that transforms a neutral sight or sound, like the notification ping on your phone or the smell of a bakery, into a must-have signal. It's purely dopaminergic. It's the engine that kept our ancestors foraging when food was scarce. It creates a state of tension, a psychological itch that can only be released by moving toward the object of desire. Interestingly, this state isn't actually pleasant. If you pay close attention to the moment of intense craving, it feels more like anxiety or high pressure, physical drive than joy. It is the promise of the reward, not the reward itself. Liking, on the other hand, is the actual consumption phase. This doesn't seem to care much about dopamine, but it relies on parts in the brain that are triggered by opioids and endocannabinoids. Think of it as the difference between the energy of a marathon and the deep breath you take after crossing the finish line. One gets you there, the other lets you enjoy being there. While dopamine is about more, the opioid system is about enough. It's the feeling of satiety, warmth, and genuine sensory pleasure. The real problem occurs when these two systems become decoupled. In the early stages of a habit, you likely want what you like. However, through repeated overstimulation, the wanting system can become hypersensitized. It grows louder and more demanding. At the same time, the liking system often undergoes the downregulation we discussed earlier, meaning your actual capacity for pleasure diminishes. This creates the state of wanting without liking. People often feel an overwhelming need to engage in a behavior like scrolling, gambling, substance use, yet the moment they do, they find it hollow, boring, or even repulsive. The dopamine system is still firing on all cylinders, screaming that this is salient, but the opioid system liking has checked out. Let's talk about the homeostatic seesaw. I think it's a really important chapter to understand how dopamine works. Think of your baseline dopamine as your resting state of motivation. It's the level of chemical drive that makes you get out of bed, focus on a conversation, or feel a quiet sense of purpose. A spike happens when something exciting occurs. The catch is that for every action, there is a reaction. When you push the pleasure side of the scale up with massive spike, the brain doesn't just let it hang there. To prevent overstimulation, the brain exerts a counterforce, pushing the scale down in the pain or deficit side. This is fundamental survival mechanism. If you ever felt an inexplicable sense of flatness or irritability right after high excitement event, you felt that counter push. When the spike ends, your dopamine doesn't just glide back to your previous baseline. It overshoots and drops below it. Think of it as the Gray Monday effect. If you spend your entire weekend stacking high stimulation spikes, like scrolling through endless short form videos, eating highly processed foods, gaming for hours, you are borrowing dopamine from the future. By Monday morning, your baseline is submerged. Things that should feel fine or okay suddenly feel excruciatingly boring or even depressing because your brain is trying to find its balance again. One thing I've noticed is how easy it is to layer dopamine triggers without realizing it. We listen to high energy music while scrolling through social media, while drinking caffeinated drinks. Each of these adds its own spike. When you layer these stimuli, you create a massive peak. The problem is that through that follows will be equally deep. If this happens occasionally, the brain recovers. But if it becomes a daily habit, your brain begins to realize that the volume is always too high. To protect itself, it engages in down regulation. It literally removes dopamine receptors from the surface of your neurons. As your receptors disappear, your baseline level effectively stays lower. Now you need those high-intensity spikes to feel normal. The activities that used to give you a rush now barely move the needle, and the quiet moments of life, like reading a book, walking in nature, or deep work, become almost physically unbearable. In my view, this is the root of the modern attention problems. We haven't lost our ability to focus, we've just pushed our baseline so low that focus feels like a chore rather than the natural state. There's a pervasive myth that more dopamine equals more motivation. In reality, the relationship is likely more of an inverted U shape. If dopamine is too low, we are lethargic. If it's too high, or if the receptors are fried, we become frantic, anxious, or paradoxically unmotivated because this system is already maxed out. True sustainable motivation seems to come from protecting our baseline and finding joy in the effort itself rather than just the hit at the end. Another chapter, the modern overstimulation trap. If you look at the seesaw of dopamine we discussed, modern life acts like a giant weight permanently pressing down on the pleasure side. We've managed to take every ancient survival trigger, food, social connection, sexual signaling, and strip away the effort, leaving only the concentrated chemical hit. The most pervasive trap is undoubtedly the infinite scrolling on social media. If every post you saw was amazing, you would eventually habituate and put the phone down. But because the reward, a funny video or a clever insight, is intermittent and unpredictable, your dopamine system stays in the state of constant high alert wanting. In my view, scrolling is about the possibility of the next piece of content. This keeps the dopamine pathway firing indefinitely. You aren't actually liking the videos. After the first 10 minutes, you are simply trapped in the wanting loop, hunting for a spike that rarely satisfies. We also have to consider what I call the supernormal stimuli. There are two things that are bigger, stronger, and louder than anything nature intended. First are ultra-processed foods. Those foods are engineered to hit a bliss point of fat, salt, and sugar that overrides our satiety signals. They trigger a massive dopaminergic surge that makes whole foods feel bland by comparison. Another important one is pornography. In a similar vein, digital intimacy provides a density of novelty and mate selection that would be impossible in the physical world. The danger here is that these high magnitude spikes lead to rapid down regulation. When the brain is exposed to such loud signals, it quickly hides its receptors. When people overindulge in these areas, their tonic baseline drops so low that the real-world interaction or home-cooked meal feel like they aren't enough. Dopamine is deeply attracted to novelty. Every time you switch tabs, check a news headline, or glance at the notification, you get a tiny micro spike. We often mistake this for productivity, but it's actually just fragmented attention. Multitasking is, in my opinion, one of the most effective ways to drain your dopamine reservoir. By constantly shifting focus, we are perpetually triggering prediction errors as we encounter new information. This feels stimulating in the moment, but it's cognitively exhausting. It leaves our executive center unable to maintain the deep, sustained focus required for meaningful work. In the past, rewards were buffered by effort. You had to walk to the forest to find berries. You had to wait for a letter to arrive. This effort-reward coupling protected our baseline. Today, that the buffer is gone. With high-speed internet and delivery apps, we have endless access to dopamine. The trap isn't necessarily the things themselves. Social media or burger isn't evil, but rather the frequency and density of the stimulation. We are essentially short-circuiting the reward system. When we remove the struggle from the pursuit, we lose the biological ability to appreciate the reward when it finally arrives. It's a state of being highly stimulated, but deeply dissatisfied. Low baseline dopamine and identity. When someone lives with chronically low dopamine baseline for long enough, they say, "I'm just a lazy person," or "I've lost my spark." The hallmark of low dopamine state is agonizing gap between intention and action. You might sit on the couch, staring at a task you know is important, mentally rehearsing the steps to start it, yet your body doesn't feel the desire to start. When the baseline is submerged, the cost of starting a task feels disproportionately high compared to the perceived reward. In this state, procrastination is a form of physical protection. The brain is essentially saying, "We don't have enough fuel in the reservoir to justify this expenditure." This chemical low tide often manifests as brain fog and emotional flatness. Because dopamine is so critical for the prefrontal cortex's ability to filter noise and focus, a low baseline makes the world feel fuzzy. Your internal signal-to-noise ratio is off. Furthermore, the emotional landscape becomes monochromatic. If the peaks of joy are gone and the itch of desire is silenced, you're left in the state of grayness. It seems to me that many people aren't necessarily depressed in the clinical sense, but are rather chemically over-adapted to a high-stimulation world that has left their natural reservoirs empty. The real danger lies in nervous system adaptation. The human brain is remarkably good at finding stability in any state, even a dysfunctional one. If you spend months or years in low dopamine state, your internal narrative begins to stabilize around that chemistry. This is a form of identity stabilization. We start to build a story of me that explains our lack of drive. We view our procrastination as a character flaw rather than a signaling issue. Once this happens, the chemistry is no longer just a temporary state. It becomes a lens through which we view our entire reality. Because you feel flat, you seek high-intensity spikes like social media or junk food to feel anything. As we've discussed, these spikes further lower the baseline, deepening the fog and flatness. You end up in a loop where your behavior reinforces your low dopamine identity, and your low dopamine identity justifies your behavior. Breaking this cycle is incredibly difficult because the very tool you need to fix it, drive, is the thing that is missing. It's like trying to start a car with the battery by driving it around. Next chapter is called Spike Lifestyle versus Stable Drive. Life is a strange irony. We spend our weeks dreaming of peace, yet when we get it, we often find ourselves reaching for our phones within minutes. This struggle is the ultimate collision between the spike lifestyle and stable drive. It seems to me that we are essentially choosing between two entirely different operating systems for lives. The spike lifestyle is reactive. In this mode, we aren't generating our own momentum. We are simply responding to external jolts. This is the cycle of hitting the snooze button until the last second, relying on 3 cups of coffee to focus, and then unwinding with high-stimulation entertainment. The problem here is the slope of the crash. When you rely on these external peaks, you are effectively dopamine debtor. Each spike is followed by the period where the brain is less sensitive to normal life. People living in this cycle often feel fine, but when they are busy or stimulated, but the moment the stimulus drops, during a quiet commute or slow evening, they feel a crushing sense of boredom or even dread. On the other hand, we have what I think of as a stable drive. Stable drive is a proactive state where dopamine is released not by the event, but by the pursuit of it. In this cycle, the calm is the foundation. Calm. You start from a place of regulated baselines where your receptors aren't overwhelmed. You engage in effort contingent tasks, things that require work before they pay off. The dopamine release happens incrementally as you make progress. This is internal generation. Instead of waiting for notification to give you a hit, you generate a slow, steady drip of dopamine through the act of doing. This doesn't lead to a crash, it leads to a sense of competence. It's the difference between the cheap dopamine of a win in a video game and the expensive dopamine of finally mastering a difficult piece of music. One is a loan, the other is an investment. This is perhaps the most difficult hurdle to overcome, the fact that chaos is addictive. When your brain is used to a spike lifestyle, peace feels like a withdrawal syndrome. If you are accustomed to 10 out of 10 stimulation, a 3 out of 10 walk in the park feels like 0 out of 10. If you come to believe that I've come to believe that boring is actually a sign of healing. It's the sound of your nervous system resetting its expectations. Now let's discuss rebuilding your dopamine baseline. Modern world has essentially hacked our reward systems. Rebuilding a baseline is about stacked recovery. I see this process not as a series of chores, but as a systematic re-sensitization of your nervous system. Let's start with the biological anchors, sleep and sunlight. I found that you simply cannot hack your way out of dopamine deficit if your circadian rhythm is fractured. During deep sleep, the brain's cleaning system is active. But more importantly, for us, this is when dopamine receptors replenish. Without quality sleep, you wake up in a dopamine hole, which is why you immediately reach for your phone or double espresso. Viewing bright light, ideally sunlight, within the first hour of waking triggers a timed release of dopamine and sets a countdown for melatonin later. It's foundational tonic signal. It tells the brain the day has started. Begin the steady drip of motivation. Next part is movement and cold exposure. We often think of exercise as a way to burn energy, but in terms of neurochemistry, it's a way to earn dopamine. Movement, especially zone 2 cardio or strength training, creates a sustained, slow-release rise in dopamine that can last for hours. Then there is a deliberate cold exposure, the cold shower or ice bath. Cold plunge can increase dopamine levels by as much as 250%. The critical difference between this and junk dopamine spike is that the rise from cold is slow and the decline is even slower. It doesn't lead to a crash, it effectively raises the floor of your baseline for the entire afternoon. Deep work and delay. Delayed gratification is key. This is the literal exercise of steering wheel we discussed earlier. By committing to a single task for 60 to 90 minutes without distraction, you are training your brain to find dopamine in the process rather than in the completion. It's the shift from the result-oriented to effort-oriented reward. Reducing overstimulation. This is where digital boundaries become non-negotiable. I'm a proponent of the dopamine-free morning. By avoiding the infinite scroll for the first hour of the day, you prevent a massive phasic spike that would otherwise set your baseline too high, making the rest of your day feel like a slog. Stress regulation and the brake system. High stress, chronically high cortisol, is the natural enemy of a stable dopamine baseline. When we are constantly in a flight or fight state, the brain prioritizes immediate impulsive rewards to soothe the nervous system. This is why we crave junk food when we are stressed. Learning to regulate the nervous system, whether through breathwork or simply doing nothing for 10 minutes, allows the brain to step off the gas. It signals the reward system that we are safe, which in turn allows the more sophisticated dopamine pathways, the ones that help us to plan and build, to take over from primitive craving pathways. Rebuilding your baseline is, in its heart, the act of lowering the volume so you can hear the music again. For the first few days or weeks, life might feel a bit boring. I encourage people to view that boredom not as a void, but as their receptors upregulating, healing. Let's discuss intentional dopamine strategy. I found that people approach dopamine management like a crash diet. They go to extremes, burn out, and end up right back where they started. In my view, the truly effective strategy isn't about punishing yourself. It's about becoming a sophisticated architect of your own drive. Stimulus fasting is not about sitting in the dark room and staring at the wall for 24 hours. Rather, it's about strategic recalibration. You are giving your overstimulated receptors a break from supernatural stimuli like porn, high-speed gaming, or TikTok, so they can regain their sensitivity to normal life. I think of it as a palate cleanser for the brain. If you stop eating spicy, high-processed food for a week, a simple apple suddenly tastes incredibly sweet. This is the goal, to make the ordinary feel rewarding again. Most people wait to feel good until they've finished the project. But if you only reward the outcome, the middle of the project becomes a dopamine desert. I suggest a technique I call reward the friction. When you sit down to work and feel that initial resistance, that urge to check your phone, tell yourself this friction is already where the growth is happening. By consciously deciding that the struggle is the win, you trigger a release of dopamine during the work itself. This turns boring into challenge. This is how athletes train themselves to love the burn of the muscle. They've successfully attached the chemical reward to the physiological strain. The brain loves evidence of progress. If your goal is write a 50,000 words book, your dopamine system will likely stay dormant because the reward is too far away. Instead of giant to-do list, use a done list. Every time you finish a small segment, even just opened the document and wrote one sentence, mark it down. This creates a micro spike that fuels the next 10 minutes of your work. You are essentially using the dopamine from tiny success to fund the effort for the next step. It's a self-sustaining loop. Willpower is an inexhaustible resource, but rituals are automated. When you ritualize your discipline, you stop having the should I or shouldn't I argument in your head, an argument that, by the way, is incredibly draining on your dopamine baseline. Maybe you put a specific pair of noise-canceling headphones, drink a specific type of tea, set 25-minute timer. Eventually, the brain associates these cues with a steady dopamine release. The ritual itself starts the flow before you even begin the task. You've created a conditioned response that bypasses the need for raw willpower. To make this real, I recommend creating a dopamine menu for yourself, divided into 2 columns. As you can see, one column is cheap dopamine, creating a debt, and the other one is expensive dopamine, creating the investment. The goal is not to never touch the left column, but to ensure that at least 80% of your chemical income is coming from the right. Let's go through the review and action steps for the next days. Before we move into action, let's consolidate the key parts that we've covered in this presentation so far. Dopamine is pursuit. It's the molecule of more, not necessarily the molecule of joy. The seesaw is absolute. Every high-intensity spike must be repaid with a subsequent dip, the debt. Identity is fluid. Your laziness or brain fog is often just a symptom of submerged baseline. Effort is the key. Stable drive comes from internal generation. Attaching reward to the friction of the task, not just the finish line. Let's discuss the action steps for each day. First 90 minutes of the day. I found that the way you handle your morning dictates the dopamine ceiling for the rest of your day. If you spike your dopamine to a 10 out of 10, by scrolling in the bed. A productive work session at a 6 out of 10 will feel physically painful. Keep your phone in another room for the first 60 to 90 minutes of your day if possible. This prevents the variable reward spike of notification from setting your baseline too high. Get 10 or 20 minutes of direct outdoor light. End your shower with 1 or 2 minutes of cold water. Actions during the day. To maintain this, you need a clear visual of where your income is coming from. I suggest actually writing out your dopamine menu and sticking it on your desk. As you can see in the presentation, there is an example. Long-term actions to finish the presentation. The most successful people I know don't have more willpower than you, they just have better rituals. When you ritualize a difficult task, you bypass the wanting system resistance. The done list habit. At the end of each day, write down 3 micro wins. This forces your brain to acknowledge progress, which prevents the negative prediction error that leads to burnout. Once a week, schedule lower volume day, no podcast, no social media, no high intensity work. Let your receptors upregulate so that Monday morning actually feels exciting. The first few days of recalibrating will feel like withdrawal. You will feel bored, restless, and perhaps a bit flat. Stick to the routine. You will be greatly rewarded. Thank you everyone for watching the presentation. If you are interested, you can check my second YouTube channel, Philip Fields. And until another presentation, see you next time and thank you.